Today, I want to share with you guys my favorite all-time broadcast interview.
Boris Johnson.
Because to me, it highlights at a very high level that broadcast journalism, TV journalism, is as much a game as it is anything else. This interview is particularly great because each character, Jeremy Paxman, the laconic but persistent interviewer, versus Boris Johnson, the bombastic and foxy interviewee, both understand the game. They were both journalists and have been journalists for a long time. And like any good conflict, each wants something different. It's two characters going tete-a-tete. Jeremy Paxman is trying to break some sort of scoop or news that Channel 4 wouldn't have, or Sky News, or the New York Times doesn't have. So they want some sort of headline or a juicy piece of information that Boris Johnson is going to give them. He's going to try to extract it like honey out of Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson doesn't want to disclose any information that's going to break news. He wants to toe the party line, stay to the message, talk about what the achievements he's done as mayor of London, and stand in solidarity with the Conservative Party, which he is part of at this time. So that's painting a picture. So let's see how each character goes about trying to accomplish their goals. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to examine other interviews with a newfound perspective. So let's go ahead and watch. Let's get into it.
Boris Johnson, David Cameron described the riots this summer as revealing a sickness in parts of our society. Do you agree with that?
I certainly do. I think that the riots were like kind of flipping up a big fat rock and seeing some things I think we've been hiding from ourselves.
Okay, so very off the top here, Jeremy Paxman asked Boris Johnson a question about another of his party. At this time, David Cameron was the Prime Minister of the UK and was also a Conservative. So he's asking Boris Johnson, another Conservative, to comment on his Prime Minister. This is a really soft, subtle, honey-like way to ooze into the conversation so Jeremy can see if he can split any hairs between Boris Johnson and David Cameron.
It's about boundaries and giving kids discipline and all the rest of it. And certainly I think that there are issues, and you've got to look at the sense of easy entitlement that too many young people have, and you've also got to look at ways of steering them onto better things.
So would you like
to say that there's a problem or a sickness or whatever metaphor you want to use is to me quite sensible.
So Boris Johnson agrees with David Cameron in a kind of long and windy politician-esque answer. Standard par for the course. Let's keep going.
Is to me quite sensible.
So would you like to withdraw your comment when you describe the allegation?
Because I know what you're going to say.
So now is where this gets interesting, because now that Boris Johnson has agreed with David Cameron's statement that, oh, the United Kingdom does have a sickness, this London riot is a sickness, but you can heal from a sickness, Jeremy Paxman sets up the question, well, since you agree with David Cameron, do you want to withdraw your comment calling the UK piffle? As in, that seems like a much harsher term than you're now saying you agreed with David Cameron. And Boris Johnson recognizes this setup, and so he cuts off Jeremy Paxman right away. Now let's keep watching.
Or my comment that if you say that Britain is broken,
you said it was piffle.
Then I think I was right, because this is a distinction without a difference.
So here you can see Boris Johnson not quite actually recollect entirely what he said, what he's being quoted. He remembers he said something about it being broken, about it being piffle. And here Boris Johnson is willing to concede, well, actually, that's not that bad of a thing to say. Sure, I'll agree to having said that. That's fine.
This is a distinction without a difference. This is what I'm saying, and this is let's be absolutely clear. I think Britain is the most fantastic country on earth. Obviously.
Yeah.
No, wait. It's a very important point.
You've just said
So here's a nice throwaway line. Boris Johnson tries to say, oh, of course I love the UK, and Paxman won't have it. Yeah. Forget the political lines. Let's get back to my questions I'm asking you.
Obviously. No, wait. It's a very important point.
But you've just said
the
accusation that parts of it are sick is true.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that the machine, that the organism as a whole is fatally flawed or vitiated. So to say that something is broken, if you say that camera is broken, then it wouldn't function at all, would it?
Well, it could be broken and still function, obviously.
No, if it was in common parlance, Jeremy, if you said that camera was broken, then it wouldn't function.
So here is actually a very good misdirection technique. Boris Johnson recognizes, like, if I can ground what I'm talking about in something concrete that the viewer might understand, I can better convey my message. So he's immediately looking for some concrete example. This is actually a technique Donald Trump uses a lot when he says, like, I'm going to build a magnificent brown, beautiful wall. You know, it's going to be 10 stories high, exactly like. He's very descriptive, and this helps the viewer imagine whatever the politician wants to say.
It wouldn't function. You say, I've got a broken camera, but it's still working. People wouldn't understand what you were saying. That camera is not broken. There may be parts of it that could do it. In fact, I can see it. When I look at it, I can see the parts of the underside of that camera that are a bit scuffed.
Yeah. So bits of Britain are scuffed. That's what you're saying.
Okay, so this is actually good. This is a nice little point for Boris Johnson, who was able to somehow turn what he said into scuffed. So now you're left as a viewer, and even Jeremy Paxman saying, well, okay, I guess he's referring to the United Kingdom as scuffed, which sounds much more tame than what he originally called it as broken and piffle. Nice maneuver.
Things are always in need of attention.
Okay. Let me ask
there
you
are problems that are always
question.
in need of addressing, and clearly there are very serious issues in our society that need tackling. And what the riots
is inequality
showed,
one of them?
What the riots
Do you think
showed,
we're too unequal a society?
This is good. So Paxman now has pivoted about 90 degrees here and asks, do you think inequality is one of them? So tangentially related to problems in the United Kingdom, but a very specific question he's now putting to Boris Johnson.
Do you think we're too unequal?
What the riots
Do you think
showed,
we're too unequal a society?
I do. And you
do think it's too unequal a society?
Yes.
And you can see now, okay, Boris Johnson's thinking about the question. His gut reaction is, yes, I feel like there's too much inequality. But he doesn't know what he's going to say quite yet.
I think it's too unequal a society.
Yes.
Well, why do you want to make the inequality worse then?
And you have to look at the
You do want to
reasons.
make it worse, don't you?
No. You have to look at the
You
reasons.
want to abolish the 50p rate of tax. That would make the inequality worse.
That wouldn't, or it would. You just say
It would.
Well.
So another nice, precise question by Jeremy Paxman here, slowly lowering the hook further and further. First, do you think there's too much inequality in the United Kingdom? Two, well, don't you want to increase inequality? No. But you're in favor of repealing the 50p tax rate. We have a nice logical sequential order here that's hard for somebody, to weasel out of, because you've just said, like, no, I do think there's too much inequality. Well, no, I'm not contributing to the inequality. Oh, wait, I guess I am in favor of the 50% tax repeal. That sounds like I'm contradicting myself then. Let's see how Boris Johnson responds.
You want to abolish the 50p rate of tax. That would make the inequality worse.
That wouldn't, or it would. You just say
it would.
Well,
Clearly
I don't. I'm not certain.
Richer people would have more money left.
I'm not certain that's true, because, as you know, you can't necessarily make poor people richer by making rich people poorer. And what you can do, though,
but it would mean that rich people had more money in their pockets by definition.
Well, there's an argument to be had about competitiveness. And about...
That's a different argument.
No, it's exactly the same argument.
You've just conceded we're too unequal a society.
Yes, and I think...
wonder then, in that context, why you think rich people should be able to keep more of their money.
The argument is, that just so we can be clear, the argument is that if you create conditions and the right tax framework, safe city, all those are part of it. You create conditions in which business can prosper, enterprise can flourish, then you will drive jobs and growth for everybody. And that's the argument. That is the argument for having a competitive tax regime.
So Boris Johnson's first attempt to respond to this is to make an academic argument, which is to say, well, while on the surface it may seem like repealing the 50% tax rate might contribute to inequality, there's a Laffer curve argument. He's making a more nuanced economic argument that the higher you increase the tax rate, there becomes an edge at which people just stop paying taxes and then try to avoid it. So your actual collection of money goes down after a certain amount of time. This is called the Laffer curve. Many economists disagree over it, but it is an economic term. You can look it up if you want. Laffer, L-A-F-F-E-R curve. Let's continue.
People retain more of their money if you remove the higher rate of tax. That's self-evidently true.
There is a lot of ambiguity about how much the 50p tax rate actually raises, if we're honest, and the Treasury is looking into it. And the second point
That's another argument.
The second point is that you've got to look at the context in which a city like London, the whole UK economy, is competing. The way to tackle inequality is to look at what is happening to people in the bottom deciles of society. Look at what they are really being deprived of. Because we talk about deprivation, and the issue is deprived of what by whom. And it may very well be that what people need is they need better education, and they need a greater sense
stronger
of
framework, stronger sense of community,
exactly
a sense of
right.
being loved and so on.
Okay, so Paxman now just is, yes, it's more politician talk. Yes, they need better education, more infrastructure, blah, 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 blah. Every politician says this. I'm not having a Boris Johnson. Let's get back to the point.
all those things. No, I think we're completely on the point.
On the 50,
that is what is causing inequality. Jeremy, that is what is causing...
And Boris Johnson says, no, this is what's actually causing it. I don't care if it may sound trite or cliche. These are indeed the actual reasons behind inequality.
That is what is causing inequality. Jeremy, that is what is causing...
On the 50p rate of tax, does it bother you that the Treasury clearly regards you as an eccentric irrelevance?
I'm not certain that is what the Treasury...
So, okay, nice incisive question by Paxman, cutting off the conversation and being like, okay, all these academics are aside, which are great, Boris, does it bother you, however, that your own party, which is currently in power in Parliament, disagrees with you as they didn't go with your proposal?
I'm not certain that is what the Treasury think. I think
if they didn't think that, they'd have acted on your advice, wouldn't they?
I think there are people in the Treasury who understand...
So Boris Johnson tries to deny that's actually what Parliament thinks, and Paxman presses back in and says, well, we can infer that they think this because they didn't act on your advice. Good move by Paxman. He's being very persistent. Not overly aggressive, but persistent and forceful.
This is a very, very tough economic environment we're in. People are being squeezed. People are facing real increases in their cost of living. So when they see people like me on the telly saying high tax rates make Britain uncompetitive, they think, well, so that, I don't care. The rich should pay more. And I can perfectly understand that argument. But I'm obliged to point out two things.
You've made that point.
Is in that. And second, that in the long term, in perhaps even in the medium term, you've got to question.
Okay, so this was actually a good response by Boris Johnson because he actually tailors his answer a little bit towards us, the viewer here. Even though he's still talking to Paxman, he's bringing us in the viewer and recognizing that, listen, I realize when the viewer watches me get up on television and talk about these academic arguments about how lowering the tax rate might actually increase revenue generated by Parliament is all nonsense because most people feel like they're already paying enough tax or there's already too many wealthy people, which is a good maneuver. Once again, pulling in the audience, telling them, hey, I recognize how you're perceiving this, but nonetheless, listen to me. And this is a good technique as an interviewee to do that a lot of interviewers are not very good. They're not very good at pulling in the audience to kind of empathize with the audience and say, listen, I empathize with how this may sound academically, but hear me out.
A higher rate of taxation than America, than France, than Germany.
You made that point too. Right, let's move on. What's the difference between you and David Cameron?
Okay, so here we go. Paxman, this is great. Paxman listens, and he decides, Boris Johnson, you've gone on for too long. I'm going to once again pivot an entire 180 degrees here. What's the difference between you and David Cameron? I want to get all the way back to what I tried to do at the very beginning of our interview, which is to split a hair between you and David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister, and you, the Conservative Mayor of London. Let's see if I can once again split the party a little bit and get a headline out of this. So he's bringing this conversation all the way back around to where he started, but being a little more aggressive about it and trying to catch Boris Johnson off guard. Great move by Paxman here.
What's the difference between you and David Cameron?
Well, I'm Mayor of London. He's Prime Minister. And what else?
I'm
older than him. I'm considerably heavier. What else? I beat him at tennis the other day. I think he's probably better at tennis than me. Is the truth.
And Boris Johnson responds beautifully, magically. So Boris Johnson, of course, knows what Paxman is trying to do here. And what does he do? He interprets Jeremy Paxman's question literally. He says, well, what are the differences? Well, I'm heavier. I beat him at tennis. And of course, they both know just well and fine that what Paxman's actually trying to get at is what are the political differences? What are the ideological differences between you and David Cameron? But the interpretation of the question is fair by Boris Johnson. He's just going to interpret it literally. That requires some pretty quick-witted thinking and is an excellent way to handle uncomfortable questions. If you ever find yourself where the interviewer is asking you a specific question about, what is the difference between X and Y? What's the difference between that? How do you feel about this? Answer it very literally. Well, I feel befuddled. Or, the difference is, one is taller and one is shorter. And this is a very good way of, one, deflecting to have to actually answer the question, but two, bringing in a little bit of humor into the interview. It makes you likable, makes the audience, wins a few points for the audience on your side.
I think he's probably better at tennis than me, is the truth. What else can I say?
Politically, what's the difference? We know you differ on the 50p rate of tax, you differ on the European referendum. What else do you differ on?
Well, you just tried to answer the question.
Well, I'm trying to help you.
Okay, so here's a little interplay between Boris Johnson and Paxman. Again, Boris Johnson just says, well, okay, now you're pointing out the political differences between Cameron and I, which I guess you already know, so then why are you asking me the question? And Paxman responds very quickly, well, I'm just trying to help you out, Boris. A nice little interplay where they both understand the game, which is they're trying to get out what is the differences between you and David Cameron. That's what Paxman wants to know. That's the headline they want. And Boris Johnson doesn't want to slip up on anything and doesn't want to disclose any real ideological differences between him and the Prime Minister.
Well, I'm trying to help you, because you're talking about tennis and things, and what we really want to know is political differences. Are there any political differences between you and Cameron?
Well, I think there's a really good when did you stop beating your wife questions. You cook this one up carefully. I suspect there may be some differences of emphasis, but I'm not disposed to go into them now, because what I want to talk about on your show, Jeremy, is I want to talk about the things that matter to me, and I'm sufficiently versed in the ways of the media and indeed your brilliant interviewing technique to know that if I talk, what we're doing in London will be completely obscured in some kind of Tory split story, which is all you're trying to produce. What is it?
No, actually, I was.
Okay, so here Boris Johnson answers very bluntly, which is, I'm sure there may be some differences between David Cameron and I. However, I don't want to go into them because, one, I want to talk about my message and what I'm doing for London, and two, I understand what you guys are trying to do here. I understand what your producers are trying to do. I understand what you're trying to do, Jeremy. You're going to try to turn this into a story. You're going to make this, the hypothetical differences between David Cameron and Boris Johnson, the front line, the headline of the story, and I don't want to let that happen. He calls Jeremy Paxman out, basically, during this interview and says, listen, I'm not going to go into it because I understand what you're trying to do here. It's a good response.
What we're doing in London will be completely obscured in some kind of Tory split story, which is all you're trying to produce. What is it?
No, actually, I did want to talk about something that really matters to you. That's your future in the party. Because as you well know, people out there are talking all the time about who's going to be the next leader. And they see it as a race between you and George Osborne.
Well, I think,
would a Boris leadership be different?
Okay, so Paxman basically concedes and switches the conversation again here. And he's bringing this all in by saying, well, if you're going to be a member of parliament, you might as well be prime minister. So the audience wants to know, what could a prime minister of Boris Johnson look like? That's why I'm asking you about the differences between David Cameron and you, Boris Johnson. He's trying to justify, Jeremy Paxman is doing a very clever way of justifying, asking this question of trying to split the hair between Boris Johnson and David Cameron. He's saying, well, hypothetically, after you're mayor of London, you're going to essentially run for MP, and then, of course, I'm sure you want to be Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, why wouldn't you? Therefore, the audience would like to know what the difference in your prime ministership would look like between David Cameron's. I find this very crafty and very enjoyable. So let's watch how Boris Johnson responds.
Well, I think,
would a Boris leadership be different?
I think my chances of leading the Conservative Party are slightly less good than your chances, Jeremy. So let's be clear. I've got an issue. You may be about to make a bid for it. I don't know, but
well, if they're that good, I might.
Okay, so Boris Johnson turns it around and says, listen, I don't know about this prime minister nonsense. I think I have an equal chance of being prime minister as you do. Jeremy Paxman, this is so off in the future, let's not speculate.
Well, if they're that good, I might. So can we take it then, given your wholehearted commitment to your role as Mayor of London, that if you are re-elected, there is no possibility of you standing for Parliament?
Paxman then responds with humor, but follows up with a question, saying, well, okay, since you're going to dodge this question about what would your prime ministership look like, Boris Johnson, can we assume that there's not going to be a prime ministership, that you're not going to run as a prime minister after you're done being mayor of London?
Wholehearted commitment. So can we take it then, given your wholehearted commitment to your role as Mayor of London, that if you are re-elected, there is no possibility of you standing for Parliament?
There is not a snowball's chance in Hades or a cat.
So this is a really telling moment. So right now what Jeremy Paxman is trying to do is to get on the record a specific soundbite that locks in Boris Johnson's position that they can run, BBC Newsnight can run forever, which is that Boris Johnson said no, he will not consider himself running for Prime Minister. Definitively, Jeremy Paxman is asking Boris Johnson, so can we take this on the record as you saying you're not going to run for Prime Minister in the future? This is a great little soundbite that BBC News would love to have just to play back in the future if Boris Johnson ever did decide to run as Prime Minister, saying like, look, now he's contradicting himself. And Boris Johnson responds in kind with a metaphor. And metaphors are great for never actually denying or accepting things on the record, because you can always claim, well, it was a metaphor. And therefore, well, I never actually said no, or I never actually said yes. I gave you this metaphor that just implied or led the viewer or the interviewer to think I was saying yes or no.
Not a snowball's chance in Hades or a cat's chance. The job of Mayor of London.
Absolutely out of the question.
If you're someone you love politics and you're fascinated in doing things, the job of Mayor of London is simply the most engrossing and intoxicating, I would say, in a metaphorical way, job that you could possibly do. It gluts the appetite for power, for executive authority. It is endlessly absorbing.
And there are no circumstances under which you would allow your name to go forward to become an MP while you are Mayor of London.
No, that would be wrong. No,
be a member of Parliament while you're Mayor of London, at least. And Boris Johnson will at least concede this, saying like, yes, I'm not going to be a member of Parliament while I'm going to be Mayor of London.
While you are Mayor of London.
No, that would be wrong. No, you can't seek a mandate to do one thing.
So what's the scheme then? You become the first Tory leader in the House of Lords since what, Lord Salisbury or someone?
And you can see Paxman finds this doubtful regardless, saying like, making a joke once again that he feels like the audience is going to be suspicious of Boris Johnson as well, saying like, okay, so if you're not going to be a member of Parliament, essentially that's Congress, the House of Representatives in the United States, what's your move? Be a House of Lords? You run for the Senate instead? Is that how you're going to weasel out of this question and this on-the-record answer, Boris? Is that what you're saying? It's a good quip by Paxman.
The scheme then, you become the first Tory leader in the House of Lords since what, Lord Salisbury or someone?
But what I've always always baffles me. I'm going to be your campaign manager. That's what I'm going to do, because as I've said, you have a better chance than I do, Jeremy. I think you might well.
You don't.
You've got the gravitas. You've got the name recognition. You kind of, everybody knows that you're probably quite conservative, but even though you sort of levitate over party politics, I think you'd be Dave is eventually going to pack it in, and.
So this is a good maneuver by Boris Johnson. He's pushing the question back onto Paxman, making a joke of it, and bigging up Jeremy Paxman. He's inflating Jeremy Paxman's ego a little bit, which is a great technique if you want to get an interviewer that's asking very persistent questions off your back. Turn the interviewer around, compliment the interviewer, say like, oh, you're doing a fantastic job doing this interview. I see what you're trying to do here. Just flatter the interviewer. And Boris Johnson is very effective at doing this.
Dave is eventually going to pack it in, and.
Have you finished?
It's an offer.
Well, it's very generous, but I'm going to be declining it. You mentioned Dave.
And so Paxman's response is just to say, you're finished? And kind of shut down Boris Johnson's more rhetorical fireworks that are very effective at diffusing any sort of high-tension interview.
Well, it's very generous, but I'm going to be declining it. You mentioned Dave. Is it true that you've always felt yourself slightly intellectually inferior? Inferior.
Okay, so here Paxman's now trying to once again bring the conversation back between Boris Johnson and David Cameron. What's the difference?
Is it true that you've always felt yourself slightly intellectually inferior? Inferior.
So this is a great question. How is the interviewee supposed to respond to this? Do you find yourself intellectually inferior, Alec, to your boss? Well, as I say yes, then that makes me look like a dum-dum. But if I say no, how do I answer this question? It's a nice trap question by Jeremy Paxman here, to try to, once again, split the hair between David Cameron and Boris Johnson. So let's see how Boris Johnson responds.
Is it true that you've always felt yourself slightly intellectually inferior? Inferior. No.
To whom?
To David Cameron, your leader.
No, well, that's a new one. No, I haven't. But on the other hand, I can see where this is leading. It's not something I either see to any other human being.
Look, we know you're a shrinking violet, and that.
So, okay, once again, Boris Johnson takes a few seconds, but he susses out how this question is operating to get him to say, like, well, no, I'm not intellectually inferior to David Cameron. How dare you accuse me of being a dum-dum? And then so Paxman come around and be like, oh, so you consider yourself smarter than the Prime Minister. And Boris Johnson doesn't want to do that either because he doesn't want the headline being, Boris Johnson considers himself smarter than the Prime Minister. So he's got to weasel out of this question. It's fun to watch these two try to maneuver.
Look, we know you're a shrinking violet and naturally modest.
Yeah.
But it's not true.
No. Well, it's the first time I've heard of it. No.
It's the first time you've heard of it.
Yes.
This goes back to the days, of course, when he got a first and you didn't.
Ah.
So here now Paxman brings up how Boris Johnson and David Cameron went to college together, and how David Cameron, the Prime Minister, scored higher on his test scores than Boris Johnson did. Trying to, once again, get a little rise out of Boris Johnson.
Yes.
Does that still rankle a bit?
Well, it would if it wasn't that his first was in PPE.
Which is an inferior subject to your own.
Look, I mean, you know, this is...
Right, it is.
This is playground stuff.
Hey.
Look.
This was a great response by Boris Johnson, once again with humor and a little bit of jest.
Right, it is.
This is playground stuff.
Hey.
Look,
and your performance has not been playground-like.
What people, well, you know, I've done my best under some pretty. Look, what people want to hear about is the things that we're doing in London.
And so now here we go. Boris Johnson now bringing it back to his message, talking about the things he's accomplished as mayor of London.
Is what I was talking about
certainly was
today, and I'm very proud of what we've achieved. And what I said about crime matters a great deal to people. What I've said about investing in transport matters a great deal. All I want to do is persuade people I got another 4 years of good stuff in us, and that's what I want to do.
Boris Johnson, thanks.
Thank you.
So there we go. That's the entire interview. All in all, I just found this a delightful, tasty video to highlight that the game that is broadcast journalism, and that just as much as anything else, each is trying to use the platform for their own means. Boris Johnson is trying to stay on message, and Jeremy Paxman is trying to take this interview and access to Boris Johnson to try to rankle Boris Johnson and get some sort of catchy headline that they can run with that will split the hair between David Cameron and Boris Johnson. And they both understand, one, what their goals are. Each has a very clear goal in mind. And two, they both understand what their opponent's goals are. And you can see them both maneuver and dance around each other at a very high level with both a humor throughout and a persistence and forcefulness that you often don't get to see in interviews a lot of the time. And I just find the entire thing a delight. Let me know what you guys think, if you found this interesting or insightful, or what you thought of the interview just in general. Love to hear your guys' thoughts. Thanks for watching. Click like and subscribe if you want more daily journalism videos. Thanks for watching.